You are listening to From Embers, a weekly show on CFRC 101.9 FM about anarchist and anti-authoritarian ideas and practice. We are broadcasting from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples on land that has come to be called Kingston, Ontario, Canada, because of the thievery and brutality of the Canadian state and its empire-loving parents. From Embers is about fires, some real and some metaphorical. Fires started generations ago and tended to over the years. Little sparks all across this territory that we hope will grow, spread, and engulf the thieving state called Canada and the capitalist system that has plagued this land since the fur trade.
Today on From Embers, we're featuring an interview with Andrew Crosby and Jeffrey Monaghan, who are the co-authors of the book Policing Indigenous Movements, Dissent and the Security State. Both of the authors currently live in Ottawa and work at Carleton University. Andrew is coordinator with the Ontario Public Interest Research Group, and Jeff is an assistant professor in criminology. The book was released through Fernwood Publishing in May 2018 and is based on a series of government records obtained through access to information requests. The authors use these records to reveal how policing and other security agencies in Canada have been monitoring, cataloguing, and working to silence Indigenous land defenders and other opponents to extractive capitalism. The book includes 4 major case studies from the past decade and discusses the normalization of police surveillance of social movements, the relationship between police and energy companies, and the criminalization of dissent through the lens of the so-called War on Terror. We sat down in the CFRC studios here in Kingston to discuss the revelations in the book, the tricky politics of police accountability, some evolutions in the Canadian security apparatus in recent years, and a few ideas about how movements can stay resilient despite state repression. Would you like to start just by kind of telling us how this book came to be, like where the idea came from, and how it developed into a book idea?
It's a long, winding story. Yeah, like Andy and I, we probably started collecting materials for the book. Most of the book is put together through Access to Information Act requests, so government records about how they police and survey social movements and Indigenous movements. And we probably started working on it 10 years ago. Mostly we were kind of involved with different organizations and different campaigns in Ottawa, and it was kind of just an outgrowth of that, of kind of collecting information on what the government is collecting on certain social movements. And we eventually kind of turned it into one article that we published in 2012 that was specifically about the policing of the Algonquin of Barrier Lake, which ends up kind of being kind of adapted and updated in the book. And that's probably, we started collecting, and then we kind of over the years collected thousands and thousands and thousands of records, just kind of kept building it up. And then eventually we kind of were like, we're going to have to write a book with all this stuff.
Yeah, a lot of material.
And then we kind of sat down and did it.
Yeah.
And so what is the basic premise of the book and the basic thrust of the kinds of documents that you uncovered for the book?
Yeah, well, we're looking at kind of over a 10-year period beginning in 2006, within kind of the context of the War on Terror, how policing and security agencies and government departments are integrating their resources and attempting to get out ahead of Indigenous resistance movements. So we track various documents which kind of expose how different security agencies are coming together to make these plans and these blueprints on how to respond to what they call Aboriginal occupations and protests. So, we track this kind of integration around 2006 through various case studies, including the Algonquins of Barrier Lake and their multi-decade struggle with Canadian and Quebec governments and various resource extractive industries. So we kind of look at the tools that are the settler colonial tools that are used to kind of suppress that resistance, and then we look at following this trajectory through 2008 through till 2010. I mean, the case studies overlap, but the second one that we look at is the policing of the Northern Gateway Pipeline. So we're looking at how police and security are responding to, or even proactive policing around Indigenous resistance and environmental resistance that are saying no to pipeline proposals, more specifically that one, the Northern Gateway, which overlaps into our third case study, Idle No More, which was this nationwide mobilization responding to Canadian government legislation, federal legislation, that's impacting Indigenous sovereignty and treaty rights that was, kind of pushed through without any kind of consultation or consent. And then that was really telling how, the Canadian government and security agencies responded to those hundreds and hundreds of events, protest events that were associated with Idle No More, from teach-ins to round dances to blockades and items like that. So we see there the security state accelerating its kind of fusion of resources and how it's responding and trying to mitigate these disruptions to both the settler economy and the settler identity, the Canadian identity. And from there, the same year, 2013, Idle No More was 2012, 2013, the high point of it. And towards the end throughout 2013, our last case study looks at the policing of anti-shale gas protests in New Brunswick surrounding the Elsipogtog First Nation. And, going back to the theme from the pipeline protest of how resource extractive industries and policing and security agencies are working together with the colonial bureaucracy to suppress dissent and resistance that was set out to stop the exploration for shale gas. So the general thrust, we're looking over a 10-year period of how these various entities are coming together and responding to and trying to be proactive toward Indigenous resistance.
And so were you guys involved with solidarity with Barrier Lake?
It is part of the story. It was a really big campaign in Ottawa. I don't know if either of us were kind of key organizers, but it was a really prominent campaign in Ottawa, and we worked with kind of IPSMO, Indigenous People Solidarity Network Ottawa. That's kind of, and part of that too, and one of the kind of things that spurred it was that there were kind of these occasional kind of news reports, kind of newspaper reports about such and such government starting to kind of, doing whatever surveillance, and anyone who's kind of involved in movements know that this kind of stuff is happening. But it was getting to the point where, some of this stuff was kind of intersecting with the War on Terror, this kind of rise of extremism, domestic extremism, Aboriginal extremism, kind of language. So, we started wanting to kind of look at what the government was up to and what they were doing. And originally, like Andy's mentioning, we're kind of looking at these shifts in language and how the government and certainly the security agencies, CSIS, RCMP, are borrowing this kind of War on Terror rhetoric to start kind of reapplying resources and reapplying kind of political pressure on all kinds of activist movements. So we were kind of interested in how they were doing all of this, and then it just kind of spilled over and ended, in the book in a lot of ways is a story about, these huge bureaucracies who are engaged in all kinds of different surveillance work and preemptive policing work. And anytime there's any kind of disruption, there's just this enormous kind of institutionalized field of agencies that can just go into action. And part of this is also just collecting information. They're collecting more and more information, especially digitalized information. So really kind of part of our story is all of a sudden, the rise of social media in the, early 2010s or whatever. All of a sudden, the bureaucracy, especially with I Don't Know More, are just fascinated with the ability of Indigenous movements to be able to mobilize. And they're really concerned about their reputation. They're concerned about the media. They're concerned about all these things, and they start just collecting information. So we kind of, we're kind of narrating this reaction by them, the security apparatus and the policing apparatus, to kind of react to this change of dynamics to the social movements and their ability to get data, get intelligence, they always use these terms like situational awareness and, all kinds of information that they're collecting, this huge amount of data on organizers, and keeping this information in kind of these quasi investigations that they're able to kind of repurpose. So part of, what we narrate too is just this web of bureaucracy. So it's not just RCMP and CSIS. They're central antagonists in our story, but it also, it's also Indian Affairs. It's also CBSA, Border Services. It's also all kinds of municipal, localized police. It's also kind of these patchworks of task forces and different agencies that kind of that pop up. There's also, PCO, the kind of bureaucratic engine of the Prime Minister's office, DND, all the Transport Canada. It just kind of the list just keeps going and going and going. And part of what our effort was really kind of mapping how all of these agencies have all of these resources, and as soon as things kind of get called extremism, or they get into the national security kind of apparatus, and certainly when it starts touching on critical infrastructure, which is this whole kind of theme that we develop through the book, all of a sudden it gets all kinds of resources, it gets all kinds of attention, it gets all kinds of certain politics and priorities attached to it, that have been quite deliberate, right? These bureaucracies have built up these infrastructures, and sometimes rationalized around, the threat of Al-Qaeda or some kind of terrorism, this and that. But when they get the resources, when they get the power, when they get all the kind of new technologies and the political latitude to be able to do all the things that they do, it ends up being directed towards Indigenous movements, environmental movements, and all kinds of social movements who are threatening to disrupt critical infrastructure and different forms of economic infrastructure.
So that maybe leads into my next question, which is the book's called Policing Indigenous Movements. Why did you choose to focus kind of specifically on Indigenous resistance movements? And what is different about how they are policed?
Yeah, I think it's, going back to kind of the beginning of our story, and even into, surrounding Barrier Lake. Like, I moved back into the Ottawa-Gatineau area in 2010, and around that time, the Canadian government was trying to impose Section 74 of the Indian Act on that community to depose their traditional government and then impose an election run by Indian Affairs. So that's kind of where the journey started, where we started gathering documents and trying to learn how something like this could happen. What's happening behind the scenes. Like, it seems like this archaic piece of Indian Act legislation being used to suppress a community. So I think, going back to there, we gathering these types of documents and kind of opening up a rabbit hole, I guess, of collecting documents coming before that, where it shows that the Department of Indian Affairs has created this hotspot recording system, which is set up to monitor and report on and share information and intelligence with a plethora of government agencies and security and policing bodies. So I think going back to that point, we're just collecting all these documents and continuing to collect them. The majority of documents that we were looking at were related to policing Indigenous movements and communities. So yeah, I think as Jeff was saying, I think we decided to look at this type of language and policing tactics based on the context of the war on terror and how security agencies were gathering resources and focusing their policing resources against domestic dissent. And in their documents, they say over and over what the main domestic threats are. And those surround Indigenous movements, mainly around issues related to land, land and governance. So,
it's certainly, the national security apparatus isn't just policing Indigenous movements. We do kind of focus on that. They're policing all kinds of movements, everything from kind of queer movements to environmental movements. And certainly, the main thrust of the national security bureaucracy is still very much focused on Muslims and racialized communities. Like in part, it's a kind of a bit of a spillover effect, right? There are just so many resources and so many priorities given to national security policing. There's not, even though the amount of attention and profiling that goes into Arab and Muslim communities is dramatically over-policed, there's still not enough, boogeyman and threats that it kind of spills over into all kinds of other communities who are being framed as national security threats, which is how we kind of present how Indigenous movements are presented. But the one of the key distinctions in terms of a lot of Indigenous movements, as Andy is saying, is that they are recognized as an extra form of threat. And, we kind of weave through our kind of narrative is really very much classically colonial narratives of viewing Indigenous communities as in a kind of a couple of different ways, but threatening in various ways. Either it's a little bit threatening in terms of crime, whether it's just not obeying law and order as a form of dissent, and certainly in terms of the national security bureaucracy, when issues of land or sovereignty are brought up, accuse this kind of extra form of scrutiny in terms of just seeing these forms of politics, the demands for treaties, the demands for lands, the demands to not have different forms of kind of pre-exploration and testing and all these different things. They cue a significantly more robust response. So it's the bureaucracy itself that ends up kind of viewing Indigenous forms of challenge and threat as these kind of extra kind of policing threats. So it's really it's the bureaucracy's, part of our work is kind of looking at how the bureaucracy and how settler colonial agencies interpret policing and interpret threats. And part of it is really them seeing a certain form of politics and a form of politics that's contesting colonialism as a really kind of pressing national security threat.
So I want to ask a question then about kind of the framing or maybe the reception to the book in terms of, I think one could hear this and come away thinking, oh, Indigenous people are over-policed, or it's unfair that they've been framed as a threat to the Canadian state. I would argue that they are a threat to the Canadian state, and that is a good thing, like that they, anti-colonial movements do threaten Canadian sovereignty and Canadian capitalism, especially extractive capitalism. Yeah, do you kind of discuss that in your book in terms of, rather than downplaying that threat, celebrating that threat?
It's a great question, and I agree. Part of our book, and we actually say that we actually don't comment on movements. We comment on policing and how they interpret things. But I agree. They, ultimately, if we're going to actually talk about decolonization, it's these politics, and contesting Canadian sovereignty is a politics that we need and that we should be not only celebrating but educating settler society about that we actually have to do decolonization if we're going to talk about injustice. Like the flip side of that is actually talking about what justice would be, which would actually be decolonization. So no, like we don't necessarily express it in that way. But I also think that part of the critique is specifically when you take these kind of politics, when you're talking about respecting treaty relationships and you're talking about decolonization, the idea of framing that as a national security or even a crime problem is a fundamental problem. So I do think that, recognizing that, yes, it's a politics we need to encourage and activate in terms of actually having public discussions. I think that we need to maintain the critique of the policing agencies that try and depoliticize those movements. They try and take those movements and render them, instead of a political point that we need to talk about and actually work on decolonization, not being a colonial state, they try and depoliticize them, discredit them, make them illegitimate by saying these are crime threats, or even worse, these are national security threats. And I think that the security apparatus itself knows that it is trying to delegitimize these movements. It is part of the book as well as, it's really kind of detailing some of the overlaps with private industry. And the fact of the matter is, the critical infrastructure policing apparatus works hand in hand with the energy corporations, with the very companies that the indigenous movements, environmental movements, a vast majority of Canadians are opposing these kind of extractive economic programs for the future. Policing apparatus is very close with them. So, there's an active delegitimization of politics contesting extraction.
Can you talk a little bit about Project Sitka? And I think you guys were part of breaking the story of Project Sitka. Is that correct? I remember seeing it in the news a few years back. Can you describe what it is and what it kind of represents and its importance?
Yeah, I think it was around 2 years ago, around this time, in late 2016, where we received an RCMP report. And it kind of gave us a window into what policing Indigenous resistance, or how do they call it? Aboriginal public order events. Aboriginal public order events, how that manifests in 2015. So the report was a year-long kind of quasi-criminal investigation. And yeah, it was this kind of surveillance operation where the RCMP gathered information on 313 kind of prominent activists, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, but activists who they've targeted to have been active or could be active around, quote unquote, Aboriginal public order events. And they ran these 313 individuals through their kind of a profiling system, where they would label each of them as either disruptive, volatile, or passive. So in the end, they determined that 89 of the 313, could be volatile. They had the potential to commit a crime in a future Aboriginal public order event situation. So it's a very kind of interesting and problematic report of how these individuals were caught up in this kind of surveillance net of Project Sitka, based on these individuals were classified, based on their associations, their kind of movement between territories and provinces, and around their rhetoric, motivations, and beliefs.
And it's also really important in terms of, there's all this kind of public facing by the RCMP, by CSIS, by all kinds of policing agencies saying, we respect privacy, we respect the Privacy Act, we respect the right to dissent, we respect the rights to engage in protests. And what Sitka just undoes so many of these claims. And I think it's, on the part, a lot of folks already know that these are kind of ridiculous claims, and that, the RCMP and CSIS, they keep getting kind of caught with their hands in the cookie jar. And we know that they're doing all kinds of, especially online surveillance. And Sitka gives us a window into the amount of information they're gathering. And, they have some of their own kind of secret interpretations of law that allows them to do this, because they're forms of investigation and they threaten the security of Canada and all of these different things. But essentially what Sitka did is they tasked all of these different departments over the year that Andy's talking about. So the national security, kind of head national security shop in Ottawa, tasked all these different departments across the country saying, send us all the information, all the data you have on all of these 313 people. And they took months to go back into their databanks. They went all the way back, basically to the Olympics and the G20 in 2010. And they sent all the data from all of these different events. And they listed the kind of events that, speaking tours, conferences, obviously demo sites, protests for missing and murdered Indigenous women, anti-capitalist rallies, Olympic stuff. They listed all of these different kinds of events in the report of all these different type events that they sent all kinds of data on people, sent all of this information. No one's notified. You can't contest the data that's on you in the data banks. You don't know that this investigation's happening of you or anything like that. And they're doing this kind of funny risk model assessment of all these individuals. So it's a staggering amount of information. And some of the reports that Jorge Barrera did for APTN, when after Andy got the documents and we talked to Jorge and he did a couple of pieces, some of the people on these lists are just prominent organizers, right? It's like just prominent, important organizers doing great, very important work in the middle of these reports, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, some of the implications, I guess, are what's done with this data and this information. So, they're all uploaded into these databases that we don't know too much about, but we assume that information is uploaded there permanently and without people's knowledge. And the information is to be made available to frontline officers, kind of first responders or what have you, to an Aboriginal public order event. So the implications are that information being available to responding officers, it could influence how they respond to an event.
Mm-hmm. Were you able to infer much about the policing and surveillance techniques that are used against movements through the documents that you received?
Some of the documents talk about other policing sources. Right. So a lot of the documents are pretty careful to say that, a lot, especially around Idle No More, where they're keeping tabs on everything. So part of what, we got from Idle No More are these, they call matrices. So there are these big kind of Excel spreadsheet type documents that have the event, how many people, kind of officer descriptions. So those are, it doesn't say if they're kind of undercover or just regular officers kind of watching in all kinds of ways that we know they watch anyways. The documents have a mix of kind of police observation, open source, tons of kind of Facebook, Twitter monitoring, open source monitoring, all kinds of regular policing stuff in terms of, just kind of observational stuff of demos. And then it does talk about covert stuff, but that stuff doesn't come out in ATIP. So, there's the occasional reference where you'll see other investigative techniques, but we've never been able to crack.
Do you think that there's more integrated policing, quote unquote, where departments are sort of coordinated for these special events? Like we saw that with the G20. We probably existed for the G8 in Huntsville. And I've heard that there's one around sort of pipeline resistance stuff. And these groups seem to be able to pool a lot of resources. And I'm wondering if as a result, some have speculated that's led to more kind of long-term undercover stuff within Indigenous communities, anarchist communities, any kinds of communities that they want to sort of surveil on a longer-term level. Did you look at any of that kind of stuff, or was that more outside of the scope of your research for this project?
Over the course of the research, and especially in kind of more recent years, we certainly saw, during Idle No More and after, there's all kinds of more integrated units. Certainly with LC PogTog, all kinds of integrated units that are drawing, like you mentioned, all kinds of resources. Part of the limitations of our research that's really reporting on what can be made public through public records is that we can't get stuff on infiltrators. And it's just, I think social movement knowledge is a lot more important for understanding infiltrators that come through communities and stuff like that. And unfortunately, ours is really about what kind of records we can get from the documents. So we do get, certainly, I think part of the ongoing work we need to do is tracing, how these integrated units how they stay in place. So part of what we've kind of done is trace how they kind of emerged and what they've done for a certain period of time. But I think, the more worrisome thing, and certainly what you're saying in terms of, them being able to do more long-term policing and the amount of resources that they can draw and use for these types of things, which are quite disruptive. I think the bigger task is kind of figuring out how these things are going to move forward. Mm-hmm.
Expropriation, fucking assimilation, 500 years of smallpox blankets, 500 years.
have no history of colonialism.
All right, that track was called 500 Years, and it is put out by Police Funeral, a band out of Ottawa. You're listening to From Embers, a weekly show of anarchist news and practice here in Kingston, Ontario on CFRC 101.9. We're also podcasting, and you can check out our website at fromembers.libsyn. That's libsyn.com. And if you can just search for From Embers in your podcatching app, you will find us. Tonight, we feature an interview with Andrew Crosby and Jeffrey Monaghan, who are the co-authors of the book Policing Indigenous Movements, Dissent, and the Security State. That book is available through Fernwood Publishing and documents how the Canadian government and its various security agencies have been monitoring, cataloging, and working to silence Indigenous land defenders and other opponents to extractive capitalism. So who did you sort of imagine as your audience when you were writing this book? Like, who do you really want to read this book?
Ultimately, I think a lot of folks who are involved in different forms of organizing know a lot of this stuff. And part of the positive feedback we've gotten so far in terms of like some of the folks closer to us who have read the book and like our events in Ottawa is like a lot of people, even though we know what's going on, we read the newspapers, all of this different stuff. The strength of the book, in my opinion, is that it really kind of brings it together as a story, and it brings out all kinds of stuff that you wouldn't actually know. Like, it's actually staggering the extent of these kind of bureaucracies of control and just the way that they actually, using their documents and thinking in their eyes to kind of narrate movements is a much different perspective. So in a lot of ways, part of what we're narrating is actually how the government thinks and works and is going about this business. So it does offer, even to folks who might be quite knowledgeable, it does offer a kind of unique view. I do think in terms of broader, quote unquote, public debates, I would like to think that there is an audience outside of just organizing and just left circles and get to a kind of more liberal center ground of people who are uncomfortable with the idea of the government and the police engaging in such prolific surveillance of social movements. And I do think that there is a part of the narrative that is trying to get to that kind of, we should have charter rights and limitations on police powers, and that the government surveying everything and collecting all kinds of data on social movements, whether you agree with them or not, is actually kind of an important thing. So I would like to think there is an audience that would be receptive to the fact that, this is one of the few books that actually details the extent to which government powers in the war on terror are really directed towards domestic social movements. And there's an incredible amount of policing and surveillance of these movements that have nothing to do with crime. They have nothing to do with terrorism, right? The book doesn't, and the movements and even, the records and the bureaucracies itself, after a bit, they use the language of extremism. They use the language of critical infrastructure. They'll occasionally talk about potential crime, but they don't even think of these things really as national security issues. They use those as rationales, as ways to frame things, to put it to the media, to get more resources. But I do think that there is, if we're going to change these things and contest these directions in terms of policing and surveillance, which I think is, something we need to do when we talk about decolonization, we need to, do something about the police, that, there is maybe a message to communicate that may or may not stick.
I certainly think, like in industry, for example, oftentimes there's, so much amount of money in the budget that you got to spend by the end of the year. Otherwise, the money goes away. And I sometimes think that some of these policing agencies are just spending money because they actually have been, given so many resources because of the public fear and the law and order kind of like rhetoric that goes on. And, they'll spend like way more money than they even think that they need to spend just to justify their own jobs and the enlargement of their own bureaucracy.
Absolutely. I think that's, absolutely. And especially with these policing agencies, if they didn't spend the budgets, right, there'd be scrutiny and there'd be people saying, well, do you need all this money? Do you need all these resources? So absolutely, I think they spend. And I think the other side of that, and to a certain extent, I think less so with Indigenous movements, but certainly with the quote unquote terrorism cases that have happened in Canada, the national security bureaucracy in Canada has completely almost manufactured some of these cases into being dramatically more than they actually are for the specific reason of justifying these ridiculous resources. yeah, I think that, we need to understand police as political actors. These are organizations that are first and foremost interested in their organizational self-interests, and play politics to that game, right? They're not just neutral organizations. In the same way that, they're aligned with industry and they're part of what we describe in terms of advancing the agenda of extractive capitalism. They are also in the game of promoting terrorism. They need to maintain a certain level of threat in our kind of public consciousness to keep the money rolling, to keep the resources coming.
Yeah, and to be clear, I'm raising some critical questions, but if I'm 100% in favor of the reform of defunding the police, or like having them, if they have less money, they can hurt less people. I'm 100% in favor of that. Even if many of us are, believe in the abolition of the police or full decolonization, I think it's a pragmatic thing, right? That they have less money, they can mess with us a lot less. Yeah, I'm interested in this idea of the being able to see through the eyes of government bureaucracies in terms of their surveillance or counterinsurgency or policing kind of stuff. Did you come across documents that really surprised you when you first opened them? Like, do you have any stories like that you were just even already being somewhat cynical about the subject, reading and saying, whoa, I did not expect that?
There's probably
many. There's just many kind of like, I think the First Nations 101 presentation was probably just the most kind of part offensive, part surprising, part ridiculous.
Lay it out for us.
First Nations 101. Yeah, that was a like a presentation, like a PowerPoint style presentation created by Public Safety after Idle No More, so around April 2013. Well, not after Idle No More. Idle No More is still a thing, but after the kind of the major demonstrations and protests surrounding Idle No More. Yeah, it's very interesting seeing, reading these documents that were produced after the winter of 2012, 2013, because what was upcoming was a yes or no to the Northern Gateway pipeline. So the authorities were very concerned that if it was a yes, a green light for Northern Gateway, there would be mass disruption. So that's the context of them producing these documents following Idle No More. The First Nations 101 was a Public Safety Canada presentation that was, to educate its audience, other agencies and security agencies and whatnot, about what they believed comprised actors in the Idle No More movement. So there's this list of actors, including the chiefs, the Assembly of First Nation chiefs as an actor, the dissident chiefs, the opportunists, the neutrals, the supporters.
It's like a board game.
Yeah, and the extremists. That's pass go for extremism. So yeah, it kind of gives us this window on how they this knowledge production on actors within Idle No More.
And in terms of and part of the time we get these documents and we piece them together with kind of other documents, and it's just one of these documents that stands out. It's like, who's in this room, right? Like it's kind of this high level, this is who we're dealing with, public security kind of 101, and it's just it was just kind of fascinating in the sense that it was kind of amateurish in a way. And we found a couple of documents similar. There was one report that we feature, I think, in the very last chapter that we call the Anti-Petroleum Movement. And this was a document that was produced by kind of a task force team within the national security bureaucracy of the RCMP called the Critical Infrastructure Team, CIIT. And it was specifically a 20-page report that was circulated essentially to industry partners. So, and part of our work, part of our kind of narrative in the book is also kind of using a number of great indie journalists in Canada, indie media folks or media co-op folks who started digging up these kind of regular meetings between major extractive corporations and the national security bureaucracy that were held by NRCan. They were called the Energy Stakeholder Meetings. And so part of what we kind of start tracking are documents that are flowing between the national security apparatus and the energy companies. And one of these reports was, this kind of it's a glossy RCMP report. It's done, RCMP letterhead, and it's kind of all glossy. It's very nice. It's got a lot of production to it. It's not just someone typing away on their computer. It's like, there's plainly a bureaucracy behind it. And
Someone's baby.
Oh yeah, and it was cared for. It was very cared for, and it was thorough. But you're reading it, and it's all about the anti-petroleum movement. And you can start reading it, and it's just you're just kind of struck. You're just like, there's no such thing as the anti-petroleum movement to begin with, and then it's got all this hodgepodgery in it, where it's just. It's as someone who a lot about different movements and about kind of contemporary politics, you're reading it and you're just like, this is nothing like what is like, this isn't reality, right? And it had a couple really kind of disingenuous parts where it's kind of quoting from kind of Sun Media-esque type sources about the U.S. foundations and tides and all of this stuff. We're just kind of creeping into it too.
Foreign-funded radical kind of
absolutely,
narrative.
And so it's got some really sketchy kind of accusations in it, but it's also got, just all kinds of information kind of put together that is just kind of surreal-ish. But again, this was one of these reports too that was just so concretely anchoring different forms of disruption as national security threats. And in this kind of critical infrastructure language that had been developed over time, really kind of reorienting a whole spectrum of national security resources towards critical infrastructure. And this is really when Indigenous movements and environmental allies really got cemented into these specific bureaucracies, this kind of critical infrastructure bureaucracy.
Well, they built all that critical infrastructure through people's reserves. Like, they put the reserves right on top of the critical infrastructure, not foreseeing a future in which robust resistance movements could shut down their trains or power lines or whatever, and now they're pretty freaked out about it, it seems.
Absolutely. Yeah, and even the term critical infrastructure is used in very flippant ways, right? Like, at a certain point in the resistance efforts at Barrier Lake, all of a sudden, a fairly modest highway in Quebec was deemed critical infrastructure.
Major critical infrastructure.
So, it's become a very flexible tool that all of a sudden, if there's any forms of disruptions, blockades, protests, it's a very powerful tool now that's kind of been bureaucratized and institutionalized that all of a sudden cues significant responses.
The final striking point from that report, which we talked about, which is it's a bit silly and unbelievable, is the climate change denial language in it as well. Accusing the extremists, the anti-petroleum extremists, of their perceived grievance in relation to climate change.
Yeah, and it even had kind of climate change denial language saying, that the accusation of anthropocentric
alleged climate change.
Yeah, like it's really kind of striking language, but it's telling, right? And I think, the fact that this is, a document that's really about educating the oil industry, it's also part of an effort that, the critical infrastructure, national security apparatus, we're really trying to bring the energy companies in as kind of proxy spies, right? They want to be able to bring them in and their private eyes and their security operations into the intelligence loop. So it's really about them working together. They're establishing a very kind of mutual relationship.
Another part of those meetings that you mentioned, the energy sector stakeholder meetings, they're all coming together, but the energy reps are given secret security clearance in order to come into that room with the police and intelligence people.
Yeah, it somewhat clarifies the relationship between the Canadian state and extractive capitalism, for example.
Absolutely.
Which is useful to illustrate for people, I think.
Yeah, and we have some funny stuff in there. Even, part of those meetings, they'd have coffee and lunch. They're conferences, right? There's 50 people, there's 70 people, maybe even 100 people at one of them. And, there's conference lunches sponsored by Enbridge, right? Building Gateway. Right, like there's just it's just plainly there's just friendships and affinities there that are just so clear, that are often hit. These aren't part of the media reports. These aren't part of what we, as people watch and read the news, see regularly. But when you actually see the documents and you're kind of seeing into their world a little bit, there's close friendships. They're buddies. We read some of their emails, right? They're talking about whatever, the weather and fishing.
What kinds of lessons do you think those who are involved in these movements can take from your book in terms of understanding how governments and corporations are working to thwart our efforts? How do we limit that damage that they're trying to do?
Well, I think a lesson coming out of the shale gas protests in southeastern New Brunswick around the Elsipogtog First Nation in 2013, there's a few lessons there. I mean, we see early that year, we see kind of the amalgamation, the fusion of resources from SWN Resources, the gas company, the RCMP, the New Brunswick government, their public safety unit, private security force. So we see them all coming together, making this elaborate plan and training and planning for what they expect is resistance. They expect to meet resistance once they open up seismic testing in May of that year. So they've been planning, they plan months in advance for it. And what happened over those series of months was concerted resistance efforts to disrupt and to stop the exploration from happening. And it was successful. So I think, there's a lesson there about kind of disruption. Yes, if you're disruptive, you get fed into this security framework of extremism, and you're framed as a national security threat. We certainly see that in the anti-petroleum report and Project Sitka and documents coming post 2013. The Mi'kmaq resistance there was framed, like we've even seen the language used as violent Aboriginal extremism. So we've never seen that the violent adjective used prior to that, or I haven't. Moving forward beyond that, even suffering a violent police raid in October of that year, where over 200 officers, RCMP, there's actually over 450 RCMP involved in that operation, according to their documents. Maybe not just the raid, but the overall policing operation. Vast amounts of resources directed against a very small kind of blockade camp. And just the resilience of it coming out of that. And, 2 more months of conflict and injunctions and disruption. And the company ended up packing up and leaving the province before the year's end. They finished half of what they set out to do, and they left the province. And there's a current moratorium on shale gas in New Brunswick, on shale gas exploration. I mean, the government's just changed there, so Conservatives are back in power. But yeah, so a lesson coming out of that is what is effective. What can be seen as effective resistance, and of course, part of that is how that is viewed as a threat.
Anything you want to add?
I'm not sure. I think it's a really good question. I think, part of the book, and I think is a very modest lesson learned in terms of, I think we already know that lots is being collected. Some of it just shows how that works a little bit. I don't know if there's necessarily a takeaway from that. I think there's a bit of knowledge that it's useful for us to know a little bit of how it works, and that might inform practices that we do, but I don't know if it will. Organizers and people who are organizing need to make decisions about their level of publicness and all those different things. I think there's I think that's for them to figure out. And I don't think that impacts the work that a lot of people are going to do. Everyone knows that it's going to get scooped, and we need to kind of keep doing that work. So in a way, I don't want it to be misunderstood as, oh shit, like, hide or anything like that. It's like, that's not going to help anything. I do think that another very small takeaway is that it does put on the record the just complete misallocation of money around war on terror. And I think it could, in a very kind of marginal, tactical, incremental kind of way, lead towards just the importance of depolicing, of defunding, and curtailing the war on terror. And I think this is our story is that we've told about just policing Indigenous movements and social movements is a small story of the kind of broader injustice of the war on terror. So I think it adds to just smaller pieces of the puzzle that we all need to put together to dramatically rein in the war on terror and just kind of the dramatic rise of security politics and security powers in contemporary society, which I think the biggest impacts are outside of Indigenous movements, who get impacted by all kinds of contemporary colonial infrastructures anyways, but the real kind of robustness of the war on terror is far more broad. So I think those are very small takeaways from the book, but just kind of putting on the map, now that we've been in this kind of blurry war on terror for almost 20 years, putting putting on the record the kind of negative consequences and the downsides of all of these different powers we've enacted, I think is just kind of just as important as it was 10, 15 years ago, but I think hopefully can contribute to a little bit more momentum.
Have you had any kind of reaction from the security apparatus since you started doing this kind of work? Like, do you get the sense that they're reading what you're putting out or responding to it in any way?
No sense. No sense. And even in terms of, you know, our dealings, like my dealings with ATIPs and stuff like that, it's still all very professional. In a way, you know, I think we're a little bit buffered. Like our criticisms, I think, are potent and they're robust and all of these different things. But in a way, you know, we use their documents. It's like,
yeah,
you know, and I think part of the power of kind of using the documents is all these kind of denials. If we don't, you know, we respect protests, we respect charter rights and all of this stuff. It's like, well, your own documents say that you don't. So I don't know how much they actually want to engage with that, because it's kind of a bit of an Achilles heel in their argument. So, you know, there's no indication that they, you know, are impacted.
You guys have been friends for a long time. You've played in bands together. What was it like writing a book together?
Never been asked that one.
Mostly good. Now that it's done, it's great.
Yeah.
But yeah, mostly good.
Did you write like one word at a time, going back and forth? Like,
We, you know, I think, you know, Andy and I have been working together for a long time, and I think we both deal with each other's idiosyncratic characters fairly well. Andy is far more patient than I am. I'm the grumpy, impatient one, and I think he only sent 2 emails being like, come on.
deadlines.
Not deadlines, kind of like, don't be mean. Don't be an ass. But it was good. You know, you know, like from when we actually sat down and were like, let's do the book, we did it quite quickly, and we kind of did it chunk by chunk, throwing it back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a bit of a world, like it's a bit blurry. But I feel like a lot of my larger writing endeavors are kind of blurry when you're in it and you're writing and you're kind of in documents trying to craft a story. It's all kind of blurry.
Did you kind of like divide it up and then edit each other's pieces? Is that kind of how you approached it?
Yeah, like we each kind of drafted case 2 of the case studies.
Yeah.
And then we went back and forth. So yeah.
Cool.
And the good thing with writing with someone else, in my opinion, is, you know, once you're kind of sick of a document, sick of writing in one thing, you can just leave some patches open and you flip it to someone else and you say, listen, we need to talk about this and we need to talk about that. And someone with some fresh eyes and new patience can kind of jump in and get in there. So it's nice. It's nice collaborating, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So what's next for you guys? I guess the book just came out, really.
Yeah.
So are you promoting the book? Are you kind of going around doing launches, that kind of thing?
Not purposefully. I mean,
probably not as much as we should be. Yeah. I think other authors are probably a lot better at the whole sales side and like promotion side. I think, you know, we've done some media content. We've written an op-ed or 2. We've worked with a couple journalists to get kind of key documents out, stuff like that. We've been invited to do a couple of things here and there, which we've done.
Are you still putting in ATI requests on the regular, or is that kind of you taking a little break?
I don't think Andy's ever put in more.
Yeah, there's no break. You know, you keep opening up new things and chasing new, finding something, wanting to learn more, and keep chasing different kind of stories, and it's a very long process. So you're kind of in it. Yeah, I think you're either in it or you completely disengage, and I don't know if either of us can completely disengage from it.
And in part, the book is really just an opening part of the story. You know, these bureaucracies are enormous, and it's just the people inside. And in kind of Ottawa, kind of bureaucratic culture, it's like there's no Snowdens, right? There's not information that come out of these bureaucracies, especially security side, INAC too. But these are very opaque organizations that do lots of work. Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, the task of trying to get at this kind of mountain of work is kind of it's a long road.
Yeah, and I think our listeners based in the U.S. might find it hard to believe how pathetically lacking even basic investigative journalism is in this country. Like, funded investigative journalism is virtually non-existent outside of small kind of crowd-funded projects.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and especially compared to the U.S., where there are these kind of foundations that are really, freedom of the press type foundations with all kinds of money that pour money into really good initiatives. It's just there's nothing outside of, folks doing indie media type stuff and like the, small groups of academics and really good community organizations who are also very busy doing their things. Mm-hmm. But yeah, there's a dramatic lack of pressure, especially when it comes to policing and security, war on terror type stuff. There's a dramatic lack of pressure, and these organizations have been able to, for so long, just remain silent in this kind of iron curtain.
That concludes our episode of From Embers, a regular program of anarchist ideas and practice. We broadcast every Wednesday on CFRC 101.9 FM here in Kingston. We also podcast online through all the major platforms. Just search for From Embers in your favorite podcast app to subscribe to the show. The book Policing Indigenous Movements can be obtained through Fernwood Publishing online and is likely available at your local independent bookstore. Thanks for listening in. We'll see you next week.
KiteLine is a weekly 30-minute radio program focusing on issues in the prison system. You'll hear news along with stories from prisoners and former prisoners as well as their loved ones. You'll learn what prison is, how it functions, and how it impacts all of us.
Behind the prison walls, a message is called a kite. Whispered words, a note passed hand to hand, a request submitted to the guards for medical care. Illicit or not, sending a kite means trusting that other people will bear it farther along until it reaches its destination. Here on KiteLine, we hope to share these words across the prison walls.
You can hear us on the Channel Zero network and find out more at kitelineradio.noblogs.org.